Well, thank you so much for coming. I love this bookstore. You know how awesome this place is. Yeah. And I was actually, I was saying it's easy to get lost in the city of books, and then they told me that, that's what it says on their T-shirts. So that wasn't very original. But just speaking as an author, it's books like this that make it possible for people like me, bookstores like this. It is the truth. Hooray for Powells. So... So, Pity the Billionaire. What's it about? You want to know. It's about the confused era that we are living in today. This is a time when Americans are rising up against imaginary threats and rallying to economic theories that they understand only in the gauziest sort of terms. It's a book about a country where fears of a radical takeover became epidemic, even though radicals themselves had long since ceased to play any role in our national life. A country where ideological nightmares conjured up by TV entertainers came to seem more vivid and more compelling than the contents of the news pages. But that's my dumb liberal me talking. If you look at it from a different perspective, this is a miraculous time. This is a great awakening, as certain pundits like to say. It's a revival crusade in which the gospel is the old-time religion of the free market. It's the era of a grassroots rebellion and the incredible recovery of the conservative political movement from the gloomy depths of defeat. And let me confess, let's admit it, there is something miraculous and something astonishing about this recovery. Think about it this way. These are the barest facts of the matter. Right now, what we're living through is the fourth successful conservative uprising to happen in my lifetime. Each one of them, all a puff with populist bluster, each one standing slightly rightward of its predecessor, and each one helping to compose another chapter in the historical epic that I used to call the Great Backlash, and that others have called the Age of Reagan, or the Age of Greed, or the Conservative Ascendancy, or the Washington Consensus. Think about it this way. It's now been 32 years since the supply-side revolution conquered Washington, D.C., since the free market faith became the dogma of the nation's ruling class, shared by large numbers of Democrats as well as Republicans. We've now lived through decades of deregulation, deunionization, privatization, free trade agreements. I mean, the free market ideal has been projected into every corner of the nation's life. Universities try to put themselves on a market-based footing nowadays. So do hospitals, electric utilities, museums, right? So does the post office. So does the CIA. So does the U.S. Army, for Pete's sake. And now, after all of this has been going on for decades, we suddenly have a people's uprising demanding that we embrace the free market ideology, right? And this only a short while after that selfsame ideology led the world into the greatest economic catastrophe in memory. Yes, amazing is right. It's a good word. Unlikely is another good word. Preposterous would be even better. Okay, think about it. In 2008, the country's financial system suffered. It was actually just after I was here last time. The country's, maybe there's some connection, But in 2008, the country's financial system suffered this kind of epic, breakdown. Largely the result, as nearly every serious observer agrees, of our decades-long effort to roll back bank supervision and encourage financial experimentation. And the banks' stumble quickly plunged the nation and, in fact, the entire world into the worst recession since the 1930s. And yet, as I stand here tonight, the loudest political response to these events are a campaign to roll back regulation, right? They're talking about it right now in South Carolina. Who's going to roll it back the furthest? to strip government employees of the right to organize, like in Wisconsin, and of course to clamp down on federal spending. So yeah, let us give these rebels their due. Let us acknowledge that the conservative comeback of the last couple of years is indeed something unique in the history of American social movements, a mass conversion to free market theory as a response to hard times. Before this present economic slump, I had never heard of a recession's victims developing a wholesale taste for Chicago school economics or a spontaneous hostility to the works of Franklin Roosevelt. I'd never heard of that before. Before this recession, people who had been cheated by bankers almost never took that occasion to demand that bankers be freed from the scrutiny of the law, right? And the burden of red tape. That never happened. Before 2009, the man in the breadline did not ordinarily weep for the man lounging on his yacht. Now, the achievement of all this is even more remarkable when you consider the prevailing opinion climate of 3 years ago, of 2008. That's 4 years ago, isn't it? Well, whatever. After the... I don't even know what century it is. After the disasters of the George W. Bush presidency had culminated in this catastrophe on Wall Street, the citizens of Beltway Consensus Land, which is to say my neighbors back in Washington, D.C., they all agreed on the direction in which the country was now traveling. They had seen this movie before, and they knew how it was supposed to go. The plates were shifting. Conservatism's decades-long reign was at an end, they said. An era of liberal activism was at hand. This was the unambiguous mandate of history, or so they thought, as unmistakable as the gigantic crowds that gathered to hear Barack Obama speak as he traveled the campaign trail. You could no more defy this plot line, they thought, than you could write checks on an empty bank account. Now, the thinking behind all this was straightforward cause and effect stuff. The 2008 financial crisis, everyone thought, had clearly discredited the conservative movement's signature economic ideas. Scandal and incompetence had wrecked the movement's ethical claims, and besides, conservatism's taste for strident rhetoric was supposed to be repugnant, right, to this new generation of post-partisan voters that we're always hearing about. Besides, there was the obvious historical analogy that you encountered everywhere you looked back in 2008. We had just been through a replay of the financial disaster of 1929, and now, the pundits said, the automatic left turn of 1932 was here. It was at hand, with the part of Franklin Roosevelt being played by the newly elected Barack Obama. Now, the pundit-approved script for the Republican Party went like this. The GOP, they said, had to moderate itself or face a long period of irrelevance. Okay, remember all that? So what the polite thinking world, I should say, expected from the leaders of the right was repentance. They assumed that conservatives would be humbled by the disasters that had befallen their champion, George W. Bush. That Republicans would now confess their errors and make haste for the political center. The world expected contrition, in other words. And you know what it got was exactly the opposite. And I mean delivered on the point of a bayonet. Instead of complying with the new speed limit, the strategists of the right hit the gas. Instead of seeking accommodation, they went on a quest for ideological purity. Instead of elevating their remaining centrists to positions of power, they purged those guys. And rather than acknowledge that they had enjoyed 30 years behind the wheel, they declared that they had never really gotten their turn in the first place, right? The true believers had never actually been in charge. The conservative ascendancy that those historians talk about had never really existed. And all the journalistic and historical work to the contrary had been so much liberal propaganda. And therefore, and this is the most important part, that the disastrous events of recent years cast no discredit on conservative ideas themselves. So the solution wasn't to reconsider deregulation. It was to double down, to work even more energetically for that laissez-faire utopia. Now, is there water here? Oh, yes, and look, it's in a glass. That's awesome. They ran it right out of the tap, and that's the way you're supposed to do it, as I've discovered. It's an applause for tap water. You know you're in Portland when. A round of applause for tap water. Look, the social patterns of hard times are supposed to be a simple thing, as impersonal and as mechanical as the forces that shutter our factories and bid down the price of our stocks. It goes like this. Markets disintegrate, layoffs mount, foreclosures start, and before you know it, the people are out in the streets screaming for blood. That's what's supposed to happen. The idols of our past become the targets of our derision. We demand that the government do something about it, that they punish the perps, that they rescue the victims. We look for insurance against further catastrophe and for stricter supervision of the economy to make sure that this never happens again. Or so it was in the 1930s. I mean, that's how the pattern unfolded last time around. When the catastrophe comes, the Depression taught us, certain legislative deeds will follow automatically in its wake. Unemployment insurance will be extended again. There'll be massive investment in public works. Commissions will be named to investigate the causes of the crisis. Agencies will be set up to keep people from losing their homes to foreclosure. And as the economy falls apart, the assumption goes, we will rediscover a certain neighborliness, a sense of community, and even of collectivism that arises out of our shared privation. And what's more, people hurt directly by the downturn will start to take action themselves. Union organizing and a wave of strikes will sweep the country in response to the complete breakdown of capitalism's promise. And of course, the victims will protest, voicing their discontent out in public, like the striking farmers in Iowa in 1932. And this really happened. Farmers went on strike in 1932, and they claimed to be upholding the spirit of the Boston Tea Party as they emptied out the trucks that tried to cross their picket line. Now, in 2008 and 2009, it looked like the pattern was repeating itself. Our slump, sure enough, began with financial insanity very similar to what happened in the 1920s. And what's more, it's no coincidence that the bank's modern-day misbehavior began precisely as the old Depression-era banking regulations were repealed or allowed to go unenforced. And, turn the page, Frank, just as in the awful days of 1932, exactly the same thing. Average people rising up once again in outrage, fuming against the money men who drove the nation into a ditch, and the politicians who stuck by their cronies while the rest of us lost our shirts. And yes, sure enough, 30s-style populism has made a triumphant return, claiming to juxtapose decent people against an uncaring and predatory world. But should you happen to hear an homage to the spirit of the Boston Tea Party nowadays, the demands that follow, and you know this, are going to be exactly the opposite of those striking Iowa farmers back in 1932. What makes the rebels' blood boil today is not the plight of their indebted neighbor, but the possibility that such losers, as they like to put it, might escape from their predicament. That government might step in and do the very things those Iowa farmers wanted it to do 80 years ago. That 7 lean years must follow 7 fat years. Hell, that seems like a good deal to us nowadays. What burns our modern-day populists is that anyone has the arrogance to think that human affairs might be arranged in any other way. That government might somehow allow our neighbor to evade his part in the common disaster. That some mortgage remediation bill might let him out of the hard times that he so clearly deserves. The people moved to protest today are all liquidationists, to use the word that Herbert Hoover used to apply to them. What they want the world to understand is, to quote the words I saw on a sign at the first Tea Party protest in 2009, your mortgage is not my problem. Now, it's an amazing reversal. This complete inversion. How did they pull it off? How did the conservative movement do it? Well, for one thing, by learning the lessons of the Great Depression. During times of economic collapse, they figured out, and they learned this the hard way, of course, what happened to them last time around. During times of economic collapse, they learned nobody loves a defender of orthodoxy or a self-appointed spokesman for society's rightful rulers. And when the economic collapse of 2008 and 2009 came along, conservatism immediately positioned itself as a protest movement for hard times, a social uprising with all of the sort of standard outward signifiers, right? People waving placards, people protesting banks, big corporations, people yelling through bullhorns, people organizing boycotts. There were marches on Washington and big talk about strikes of the producer class. Even John Boehner talks about it, right? The job creators of America are on strike, he says. Now, what's more, the newest right cast itself as a people's movement with no leaders. A movement that's so profoundly democratic, so virtuously rank and file, so very punk rock that it's actively against leaders, right? A movement that's downright obsessed with being sold out by traditional politicians, that's always worried about being betrayed somehow, that's always trying to guard its authenticity. Now consider, in this respect, Glenn Beck. Remember him? The TV host who is, for me, he had his brief moment in the firmament, this shooting star across the, American sky, or whatever you want to say. But for me, he's sort of the emblematic figure in all of this confusion that we're talking about. He ritually claims to be a man beyond partisanship. He's deliberately imitated Martin Luther King's 1963 March on Washington. And at one point he suggested that he might have voted for Hillary Clinton had she got the Democratic nomination last time around. If you watch his show closely, and I did, I spent many, many hours watching his program to my wife's eternal, chagrin. Where is that book? Pity the Billionaire. Oh, well, it's out here. It's around here somewhere. Anyhow, I spent a whole lot of time watching his TV show so that you don't have to. Here's your easy solution. You want to know what Glenn Beck's about. There you go. He has a book of his own out right now also, and I understand it's way up on the bestseller list, so maybe you can get that instead. Anyhow, but if you watch his show closely, you'll find that Beck constantly pilfers left-wing imagery and left-wing arguments. He has this critique of the public relations industry, for example, that seems to come straight from the pages of Noam Chomsky. Or think of his famous charge of racism against President Obama, which was this sort of clumsy attempt to use this weapon that conservatives feel is always directed against they themselves. Now, the newest right also loves to imagine themselves as victims of persecution. There's this sort of, for example, this entire hagiography of persecution that hovers like a halo around the figure of Sarah Palin. This is her brand image. She is the persecuted one. When you see her when you used to see her face come on TV, you knew what they were going to say next. Someone had done something mean to her. That's always what it is. Always. There's even a biography of her that's called The Persecution of Sarah Palin. This is always what it's about with her. The woman ran for the vice presidency of the United States by whining. They're so mean to me. They're always there. They think they're so smart. They're always trying to trick me. Sometimes these fears are, become rather baroque. Consider Glenn Beck's novel, The Overton Window, which came out in 2010, and I believe you can buy it here at Powell's. If you get under the fiction section, this was Glenn Beck's novel, right? It was fiction. It was good, actually. I love, thrillers like that. I was very excited reading it. But it's in this novel, conservative activists are supposed to be, like the victims of everything that Big Brother can throw at them. They get tossed in jail on the flimsiest charges. They endure these savage beatings by the cops. The book's hero gets waterboarded after he signs up with this, sort of patriotic resistance movement. They have there's a sort of fictional version of the Tea Party in the book, and their meetings are infiltrated by police spies and then broken up by agent provocators. I guess like some modern day version of the Red Squads that we used to have in Chicago, throw my friends in jail. And you have similar fears like this come up all the time in the larger conservative movement culture. In 2009, for example, the populist right was swept by this panic, this kind of great fear that the new Democratic administration was setting up concentration camps for conservatives. You remember this? Now, upon investigation, this turned out to not be true. In fact, I looked into it, and it turns out that neither federal nor state governments, as far as I can tell, have ever mounted a campaign to criminalize the free market faith. However, I also discovered that they have used force over the years to break up strikes and imprison labor organizers and keep minorities from voting and disrupt Vietnam War protests. Today, though, it suits the resurgent right to imagine that they are the real victims of all of this state persecution. And I guess this sort of, it enhances their aura as a kind of dissident movement, taking on this merciless establishment, Now, I want to stop there, have some of this water, and change subjects very slightly. Because, it's a lot of fun to poke holes in things that conservatives say. And Lord knows I've spent years doing it and written many books, and it's a blast. And I love laughing at this stuff like everybody else. These guys blow off the facts when they feel like it. They swipe symbols from the other side all the time. They illustrate arguments on economics with fairy tales. They really do that. That's not a metaphor. The reasoning that you hear on their favorite radio shows is like, something from a brainwashing session at Lubyanka prison, right? It is preposterous. It is contemptible. But you know what it's better than? It is better than nothing. And I want to remind everybody one more time of the original cataclysms whose memories today poison our every political moment. The financial crisis and then the bailouts. Okay? And I want to remember the culprits of those cataclysms, by which I mean the people who wrecked our economy. They were not punished for what they did. They were rewarded. And when I say this, I don't mean that they got away with a slap on the wrist. I mean they were laden down with billions and our blessings. And today they are rich in a way that you and I will never be able to comprehend. And all of this happened, remember, courtesy of our government, the officials of which have conducted themselves ever since as though nothing really untoward happened at all. Oh, that bailout money, that'll be recouped, they tell us. Nothing to see here. The experts understand these things. Now, I tell you, you could not have contrived a scenario better calculated to destroy public faith in American institutions. What is the point of hard work, of scrapping for a few dollars more at some lousy hourly wage, when dishonest financial legerdemain is so profitable? Why play by the rules when they obviously don't apply to everyone? When louts and bullies and crooks walk off with society's greatest rewards. Look, the bailouts created the perfect situation for populism in the old Jacksonian tradition, for old-fashioned calamity howlers like we used to have in Kansas, right? For Jeremiah's raging against the corrupt and the powerful. And one of our two political factions in this country, as I've shown you, took to this task immediately and with relish. They tossed inconvenient leaders overboard. George W. Bush, you're out of here. Never a real conservative, they said. These guys declared war on what they call the ruling class. They assembled with megaphones out in the park and gave voice to the people's outrage. But the other faction, my faction, the actual political descendants of Andrew Jackson and Harry S. Truman and Franklin Roosevelt, they never seemed to get it. They couldn't rise to this occasion. They did not seem to understand that the circumstances today called for something different. They could not embrace the requirements of the moment, even though responding to hard times was once their party's very reason for being. Go back to the bailouts again. Look, there were 100 different ways that situation could have been dealt with, and each of them less of an outrage in the way actually chosen by George W. Bush and Hank Paulson, his Treasury Secretary. But upon taking office, Barack Obama did not break with Paulson's campaign, did not lay plans to reduce the power of Wall Street over American life. Instead, he did the opposite. He took pains to let the world know that he embraced the Paulson strategy. And each time that political adversity came over the succeeding years, the Obama team compromised in the direction of Wall Street. This is always what they do. Always compromise in the direction of Wall Street, as though that is the party that has to be mollified. Okay? Now, the economic folly of this strategy should be, obvious to every single one of us by now. The folly of it, as the idiocy of it for us as citizens and as economic actors, and for exactly the reasons that I described, that it might also lead to electoral disaster, probably never even occurred to the president's, tough guy Chicago advisors. After all, catering to Wall Street had brought only, victories to Bill Clinton. Coming around to the way of the market had been regarded as high-minded stuff back in the 1990s. It had been a statesman-like acknowledgement of the obvious validity of conservative economic ideas. But the advent of hard times made all of that reasoning as obsolete as the floppy disk. Although Democrats could never figure it out, the Great Recession repolarized the compass points of politics. Nothing worked the way it used to back in the 1990s. It wasn't any longer about, red and blue, left and right. It was about special interests versus common interests. This was the moment for a second FDR, not Clinton 2. God, sometimes when I watch these guys, they're my neighbors back in Washington, D.C. And when I watch them in action, my mind goes back to the tragically incompetent British general staff in World War I, ordering, assault after gigantic assault. Let's send 1 million men over the top. Passchendaele, the Somme, right? Only to see these armies annihilated, one after another. But still they kept at it, ordering up another round of the exact same thing, playing by the gentlemanly rules of combat, never doing anything remotely clever, right? Heaven forbid they do something clever, and always completely surprised when the other side would introduce them to 20th century warfare in some brutal new way. And sometimes I wonder what this country is going to look like when the new revitalized right actually gets a chance to do what they say they want to do. Maybe the pundits will finally be proven right. Maybe the rightward drift of the last 40 years will somehow stop, all by some magical force of history. We won't have to lift a finger, and everything will reverse itself and start to flow back the other way. Or maybe, as the nation clambers further down into the sulfurous pit that they call utopia, the thinking of our market-minded friends will continue to evolve. And before long, they will have discovered that certain once uncontroversial arms of the state must be amputated immediately. What are interstate highways and national parks, they will ask, but wasteful subsidies for leeches who ought to be paying their own way? What is disaster relief but a power grab by losers who can't get themselves out of the path of a hurricane? You know Social Security will go, of course, right? As the essential injustice of protecting the weak dawns on everybody. I mean, why should society pay for the retirement of someone who hasn't been all responsible and collected Krugerrands like every advertisement on AM radio tells you to do, right? And every problem that the editorialists fret about today will get worse, of course. Inequality, global warming, financial bubbles, one after another, but it won't matter. On America will go, chasing the only ideology that the country has left, down into the seething Arcadia of all against all. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to author and journalist Thomas Frank talking about his latest book, Pity the Billionaire, The Hard Time Swindle and the Unlikely Comeback of the Right. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Thomas Frank is co-founder of the cultural and political criticism magazine, The Baffler, and is currently a contributing editor at Harper's Magazine. His previous books include The Conquest of Cool, Business Culture, Counterculture, and the Rise of Hip Consumerism. What's the Matter with Kansas? How Conservatives Won the Heart of America. And The Wrecking Crew, How Conservatives Rule. To find out more about Thomas Frank and his work, please visit his website at tcfrank.com. If you'd like a video or audio copy of this program, you can find ordering information at the PDX Justice Media Productions website at pdxjustice.org. And now we return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Thomas Frank spoke at Powells City of Books in Portland, Oregon on January 20, 2012.
Now it is question time, and then after question time, I'm going to go eat a great big steak, and I'm going to that's what I came to Portland to do, damn it. And here, somebody's going to want this. This one isn't mine. Somebody's going to want this. Oh, no, I'll hang on to it. Okay, yes, sir, right here in front.
The first member of the audience with a question asked the author to say something about Occupy Wall Street.
He says say something about Occupy Wall Street. Hey, they're awesome. I'm very pleased with them because they've one of the greatest problems, if not the greatest problem of the last couple of years, we know the right's going to take any opportunity you give them. But you have to, if there's somebody on the other side saying something different, it makes it a lot tougher for them. And one of the things that allowed all of this crazy stuff to go on for the last 3 years, for people to insist that, if we just deregulate more, we'll finally get there. We'll finally get to that place where our economics textbooks everything works like they say it will. All of this is possible because of the silence of the technocrats, because of people like my friends back in Washington D.C., the Democratic, the kind of people that run the Democratic Party, never challenge any of this crap that's out there. Finally, somebody is doing it, and that's the critical thing. The Occupy Wall Street movement is finally giving these guys some competition for the conservative voicing populist anger. Okay, and that's hugely important. Now, you also have to recognize the limitations. We're talking about something right now that is essentially a cry of desperation. And it also looks a lot like, the bonus army in 1932, camping out in public places. It's got to go somewhere from there. It can't just stop there. We've got to build and build and build. I say we. I don't have anything to do with it. I was writing this book while that was going on, or I was finishing this book. But I'll tell you this. I know enough about the Democrats in Washington to understand that they are never going to move away from their current strategy, even if they all lose their elections. They're never going to change their strategy unless we make them. Okay? And that's where this comes in, because we've got to do that. That's up to us. Yes, sir.
The next member of the audience observed that the disillusionment in the United States with Obama is very strong. Given that disillusionment, why has there been no primary challenger to Obama? Such a challenger could probably raise hundreds of millions of dollars.
Why no primary challenge into Obama? It's a damn good question. I don't know the answer to that. My publisher at Harper's, Rick MacArthur's always like, someone's got to challenge him. If they would just put their name on the, this is what I think as well. If they would just put their name on the ballot, they'd probably, it's a protest thing, like Eugene McCarthy in '68. They'd get a considerable number of disaffected Democratic votes. It would stir things up. I don't know the answer to that. I suspect it's because unity is very important right now. I mean, he is an inspiring man. We all have, I hate to use this word, hope for him. I like him. He was my state senator back in Chicago. I still hope he comes around. But, I think it's also really damn scary what's going on in the Republican primaries. And I think people want to, they want to be sure that Democrats come together in the face of that, but I don't know. I think it would be healthy to have a little bit of dissent.
This member of the audience asked about the author's comment that he thought Obama was inspiring.
I did.
You did?
Yes.
No longer.
I thought his Osawatomie speech was awesome. Do I find him inspiring? That's the question. I did.
But now...
I think I came here and told you guys that.
but now...
This member of the audience suggested that there should be rage against Obama today.
Okay, look, let's talk about Obama. I mean, I should get straight to the subject here, okay? And what are his failings? In a lot of the issues before us, he's done something like the right thing. He's done either the right thing or something close to it. The stimulus package, that was a good idea. Now, he did it wrong. Instead of setting up a modern day WPA, which would have kicked ass, he had a lot of tax cuts. Who cares? That did nothing. I mean, it did something. It made somebody saved a lot of money on their taxes, but it didn't solve unemployment. He got us universal health insurance, but he didn't really. He dropped the ball. And like I say, every time it's a compromise in the direction of Wall Street and industry. He does not understand, that's not where the battle is these days. The other great mistake of the Democrats is the way they, and of course the bailouts, which I mentioned in my talk, and we can talk about that if you want. I can talk about this at great length. I actually researched the history of bailouts for this book. It's a fascinating subject. You'll want to know about that. But there's also this incredible rhetorical failure of these guys. Even when they're doing the right thing, they cannot explain it in a persuasive or ideological or populist way. They can't tell us why we need to do it in terms of the grand scheme of American political things. Classic example is the universal health care debate. And I like to talk about that while I'm out here, because the place where the idea for this book dawned on me was I was driving along that, where the Olympic Peninsula is? I was out there on vacation. I was driving along that highway that goes out to Nia Bay, right? Out to, what is it called? Cape Flattery. And it's this little winding 2-lane road. And I was listening to the satellite radio, and they were playing one of those town hall debates. This is in the summer of '09. Do you remember those? Where the legislator would come home, he was typically a Democrat, and he would be talking about the health care debate and all the options on the table to his constituents. And they would typically be mad as hell, hopping mad, screaming, spitting hate, and, yelling at the guy. And they would be saying, what about freedom? What about liberty? What about, big government, intruding into our lives? And you know what? These are good questions. And in my mind, the Democrat, should have stepped up to the plate and knocked that thing out of the park for a home run. What about freedom? Freedom from want. Freedom from want. This increases our freedom. This doesn't diminish human freedom. This is an essential precondition to being free. You don't have to worry about being able to afford doctor bills. This is what it's about. I didn't hear a single one of these guys say that. They never say that. They always go back to, well, the experts tell us we need to do this because blah, 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 blah. Bullshit. And again and again and again they do this. And it's like, it drives me berserk. And the same with, and a second great example, and then I'll shut up about this. Regulatory failure. Oh my God. The Securities and Exchange Commission drops the ball. You got in the Bush administration, you have these guys, and I'm sorry that I cursed earlier. Excuse me. I apologize. Okay? All right. But there's some kids here. I'm sorry, okay? In the Bush administration, you had one. I mean, there's I think 5 different agencies that regulate different parts of the financial system, and one of them. I mean, these were all totally captured by lobbyists, with maybe one exception. Right, the FDIC was always pretty good, but there's one of them called the Office of Thrift Supervision, and there's a famous photograph. You know the picture I'm talking about, where it shows the head. Hey, this guy's appointed by Bush. These are the guys that supervise like IndyMac, Wachovia. I mean, they've really got a record to be proud of, right? And the head of this agency is posing with a bunch of lobbyists. He comes from the banking industry, and he's posing with a bunch of bank lobbyists, and they've all brought garden implements like shears and things like that to cut red tape with, and they're all posing around a bunch of red tape, and there's a big sign behind that says cutting red tape, and the regulator himself, the boss of this agency, has brought a chainsaw, right, to show how much he hates red tape, damn it. And it's like, this is what was going on. And it's not just in banks. The BP oil spill. I mean, the regulators in that case were like getting it on with the oil drillers. They were literally in bed with these guys. Remember, I used to talk about it when I did the Wrecking Crew. I mean, that oil spill hadn't happened yet. Think about that coal mine in West Virginia. All those guys died down there. And this was a mine that was in flagrant violation of federal regulations. And the regulators would go down there and they would find they knew this. But they had no teeth. They could do nothing about it, or they didn't try. And plus, the mine kept 2 sets of books to deceive these guys. Failure after failure after failure. Why did they fail? Okay? And, this is a really good question. President Obama has never spoken about this. He has never come out and said, because your government was compromised, because these people took it over and wrecked it. Instead we're just sitting out here saying, oh, government can't do anything right. Government screws it up every time. He never, the Democrats are the party of government whether they like it or not. They're going to be identified that way from now into eternity because of Franklin Roosevelt and because of who they used to be. He never gets out there and defends government and talks about what government could do if you ran it right. And how government can actually increase our freedom. He never fights for it in a straightforward way. Never. It's always with these caveats. Always like, well, we don't want government to be too big, and, we don't, always, 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 always. He can never give a forthright fight on this stuff. And he thinks he's compromising with them. He thinks that's the course of statesmanship. There are no red states, there are no blue states. We're all, we'll meet in the middle, He does not get it. This is the moment that calls for, actually addressing these subjects. We are in the middle of a catastrophe here. Talk about it. Tell us what's going on. Fight. No, they never do it. Yes, sir.
The next member of the audience said that writers like Joseph Stiglitz and Jeremy Rifkin say that there's more going on than just a shift from left to right in this country. They suggest that we are actually entering a third industrial revolution and that other adjustments have to be talked about. This member of the audience said that he was wondering whether the policies of the FDR administration would be appropriate in today's environment, our current economy and society. His question for the author was whether he had read the recent column by Andrew Sullivan in Newsweek magazine, which is a strong defense of the Obama administration.
Oh, that's right. No, I have not read it. But I've met Andrew Sullivan, and I respect him in some ways. And so the question is about Andrew Sullivan's defense of Obama. And I'm sorry, I haven't read it. And about the third industrial revolution, of course you have to update, the strategies of the 1930s, no doubt about that. But I mean, I wrote an article in Harper's recently about, what it would look like if you if you set up a new WPA. What would it look like? You've got massive unemployment out there. You want to create jobs. God damn it, create them. We know how it's done. It's not like, well, we'll give them this incentive and that incentive, and we'll deregulate this, and we'll, cut the red tape. And it's like, we've been doing that. Do this other thing, please. We know how to do it. This is what works. And there's all kinds of ways you could adjust it to modern times. Build out the internet to those small towns in Kansas. Give everybody free, Wi-Fi in Hutchinson, Kansas. That's not a small town, but you know what I mean. Like, build it. They don't have the internet access out there. Build it everywhere. Employ millions of people. You could go into the public libraries of America. You could scan every old newspaper ever produced in this country and make them available for free online. And that would also, that's a really good idea for the right, because it would stop me from writing another book. I would just be reading those old newspapers day and night. It's a great idea. It would totally shut me down. Yes, sir.
The next member of the audience said that he was thinking of the author sitting at his office at the Wall Street Journal and asked if he and the journal editors had parted friends.
No, we did part friends, but I didn't. I worked out of my house. And the question is, I used to work for the Wall Street Journal, and yes, I worked out of my house. I never actually reported. I never actually showed up physically at their office in Manhattan. And yes, I'm still friends with them. I went to Harper's Magazine instead. I mean, I don't know. I don't think I'm cut out to be a pundit. I'm a literary guy. Yeah.
The next member of the audience observed how the author had described how the right, in 2008, continued going rightward very aggressively, in spite of all the setbacks in the economy, when they really should have been repentant.
Well, that's what the pundits say. I didn't, I wasn't that sanguine about it.
This member of the audience asked who was behind this strategy, who was pushing this strategy of never being repentant and always pushing further to the right.
Always pushing further?
Even at times when you'd think they'd least do this.
That is a really good question, because the strategy has been with us for a long time. Did everybody hear that? Why did the right keep pushing to the right in 2008? Where'd they get the idea? I saw this coming at the time, and I remember talking about it with a colleague of mine, and he said, I can't believe they're doing this because, first of all, there's no way they'll win, and second of all, if they do win, it's going to be disaster for the country. I mean, and they know that. They're educated men. They did it, and they were victorious. And yes, it's they immediately did the debt ceiling crisis, and it was disaster. And they're totally unrepentant. It's very interesting why they always push in that direction, and I think because they think about politics in a different way than the Democrats do. They have a goal in mind, and it is, well, for lack of a better term, it's repeal of the New Deal, reverse the 20th century, reverse that, and every chance they get, they move in that direction. It's not like, okay, we've got to reflect what our constituents say or what our constituents think. We've got to be sure that we win re-election. We do this, that. You think of the way that traditional politicians think. That's not how this movement approaches politics. They're like, what can we do to advance towards our goal? They seem to be very relentlessly goal-oriented. And, there's something laudable about that. There's a saying, I think it was Rick Perlstein who said this, that, conservatism, in their way of thinking, conservatism never fails. We only fail it. You see what I'm saying? It is unthinkable that conservatism, the doctrine, its various doctrines would fail. It's only that we failed in our execution. And you take a guy like Tom DeLay, his memoirs, and I'm sure you've got it here at Powell's. But Tom DeLay is like, conservative. It isn't that conservatism failed. It was never tried. This is the guy, the master of the K Street Project, majority leader of the House of Representatives, the great power in Washington, D.C. like 5 years ago, No, I never really got to do everything I wanted to try. I didn't get to do it. It's unbelievable. Back there.
The next member of the audience said that a friend had told him that the author used to be a Republican.
When I was 15.
This member of the audience said this was still relevant because he was interested in how the author had stopped being a Republican. He said that how people change is what we have to think about today.
Oh, good question. Yeah, how did I stop being a Republican? I mean, I was a young conservative, and when I was in high school, and I was a debater in high school, and I thought I was so smart. And I had my 20th high school reunion a couple of years ago. Golly. We're coming up on the 30th here. But I went to that, and there were still a lot of people that thought I was still, last time they'd seen me, I was this, arch conservative, firebrand high school debater, and but I was a conservative because that's the milieu I was growing up in. That was Kansas, and that was Kansas City, and that was the, all the small businessmen who were all the adults that I knew. That's what they were, and that's what I was, and I thought of Ronald Reagan as this heroic figure. God, and I would read vital speeches of the day, and I would, read Reader's Digest, and it's sort of traditional like teenager, smart guy teenager fare, and I thought I had it all figured out. And there's several things that hit me about it, or that changed my mind. One was getting a job, and you realize real quick that it doesn't work the way you think it does. I mean, when you meet the boss and he turns out to be a dunce, Another was going to college. And I don't mean that in like the traditional way, like the professors indoctrinated me or something like that. I mean, there's actually kind of a funny story about this. I tell too many anecdotes, but this is a good one. And I was at KU, and that library. What's the library there called? The big one. Yeah, and it's Watson Library, and it has this open stacks, which is a vanishing tradition. But you can get lost in that place, much like you can get lost in this one. And I remember wandering around down in the bowels of that library one day, and I came across a row of books on a shelf called The Populist Revolt. This is a famous history written in 1931. And I had never heard of that before. And I pulled one down. I was like, why do they have 20 copies of this? And I pulled one down. It had been a textbook at one point. And I pulled one down and started looking through it. And damn, it was about Kansas. I'd never heard of any of this before. What does this mean, the populist revolt? And it was all about this political movement in the 1890s and all the crazy things that they tried. All the crazy things that they did. And the funny thing was, even though I was very conservative at the time, I was totally a populist. Because everyone there is. Everyone's against the elite. We didn't say a liberal elite back then, just the elite. But what we meant by elite was always government. They were getting in your mix. They were telling people what to do, and it was none of their affair. That sort of thing. And there was this resentment of the East Coast, and this Ivy League and all this kind of thing. And I read this book and discovered that all of these symbols and all of these metaphors and all of this populism originated on the other side politically, where these people were actually calling for, like nationalization of the railroads and crazy stuff like that, and I couldn't believe it. Now, a book, of course, did not convert me all by itself. It was sort of that whole process of opening up your mind and, the stuff that happens when you go to college. But that book, that was a important milestone to me. Now, you had a follow-up, but I blab too much as it is,
This member of the audience also said that he was surprised that the author valorized the corrupt haberdasher Harry Truman and the Indian murderer Andrew Jackson.
Well, Andrew Jackson, come on now. I mean, he's also on the 20, right? And
I wouldn't like either of them.
You wouldn't like Harry Truman? Well... yeah. Well, we'll have that conversation some other time. I mean, I obviously am not. You're talking about his days with Pendergast. I'm not into that, but Pendergast is an interesting guy in other ways.
Harry Truman, this audience member explained, created the national security state.
Oh, of course. No, you're right. No, that's an abomination. Right. That's right. That's right. But he also, the man also did some great things. And the campaign of '48 was like, man, did he kick Republican ass, and he did it with a purely populist message. It was, and you go back and read the speeches that guy gave in that campaign in '48. And you're right about the national security state. That's inexcusable, and we're living with it today, and it burns me up. I mean, Obama is going down that same road, only without the populism, without the redeeming parts. And he just, every time he's like, I thought you were against the Patriot Act. Wait a second, Mr. Obama. I voted for you because I thought you were going to repeal the Patriot Act. God, it makes me mad. But go back and read those speeches that Truman gave in '48. They sound like some crazy left-wing dream today, He wanted national health care, and he wanted the real deal, Yes, ma'am. You've had your hand up very patiently.
Yes, and I wanted to get a woman's word in.
Okay.
The next member of the audience said that she had gone to college in the late 1960s, and after she retired, she went back and took some courses, and specifically a basic history course. She said she was appalled by a 40-something woman history professor teaching about the FDR administration and saying that it was all a disaster.
Yeah, what book was she using?
The teacher in this case was using her own notes and not a textbook. She said that she was in a class that was otherwise 20-year-old students who were taking all of this in. She said she raised her hand and asked the professor when in her education did she get the idea that the FDR administration was a disaster. This 40-something professor said that this was the view from the very beginning of her college education.
What you're describing is a common phenomenon.
This member of the audience said that she was appalled by this. She said her point was that it's not just conservatives, but also our youth, and it's what's being taught in our so-called liberal colleges.
Oh, it's much worse than you're making it out to be. I can make you feel even worse than that. It's pessimism with a smile. Okay, what she's saying is she took a class and was astonished to hear the professor telling the class that Roosevelt made the Depression worse. Is that what you said? Or, yeah, the New Deal was a complete failure, and that this is being taught in college courses. And I actually talk about this in Pity the Billionaire. I read or have read most of the standard works on the 1930s, Schlesinger or what's his name, McIlvaine, or there's all this sort of it's all in here, right? I'm sorry, I'm waving. I'm exhausted. You can see. I'm still on Kansas City time or something like that. But it's there's all these standard works on the Great Depression written by scholars that were very painstaking, and we all know what they are. Like the David Kennedy book or whatever you want. They're out there. If you go on the internet and search for anything about the Roosevelt administration, I guarantee you will not come across those works. You will come across stuff from the Von Mises Institute. Amity Shlaes, who wrote this book about the 1930s, or some of these other there's a whole right-wing cottage industry given to denouncing Roosevelt on the internet, so that when you go to do your research for your term paper or whatever, this is the crap you come across. And it's fascinating to me because these guys and they never reference any of the standard works on the 30s or on the Depression or on Roosevelt. They never talk about that stuff, except if they can find a guy who is like a communist or something, and they're like, communists were everywhere, But just so everybody knows, and we hear this all the time, especially from the Republican candidates for president, like Rick Perry in his book Fed Up says Roosevelt made the New Deal, or the New Deal made the Depression worse. And it didn't do anything. And he has this very interesting explanation for how he knows this. You know how he knows this? Not by studying the 30s, but he knows this. One of the reasons that he gives is because he saw that Ronald Reagan the economy boomed under Ronald Reagan, so therefore it could not possibly have boomed under Franklin Roosevelt. And it's like, and this is this kind of reasoning. I have a whole chapter about this method of reasoning, this abstract, deduction from first principles. It's ideology, yes. Who said that? Yes, it's ideology. It is a textbook example of the social construction of reality, of people denying themselves. You're in this mass movement, and you are all agreeing, on this ideological interpretation of the world, and the facts are secondary. And I don't mean this like in the sense that they're dumb or they don't know how to read, or these are intelligent people, and it's happened before in history. Intelligent people deliberately closing their eyes to the facts. You know what the facts are? 34, 35, and 36 were the American economy grew, the GDP of this country grew at the fastest rate it has ever grown in peacetime. It was over 10%. Okay? In 37, it fell down, but it was still positive. In 38, the country sank back into recession. 39, back up again. And then the war started, and the Europeans, started buying our stuff in mass and in a huge way. And but it was, the New Deal worked. There's just no two ways about it. And the contortions these people put themselves through to deny this are incredible. The tricks they play with statistics and abstract reasoning, it couldn't have worked because he put all these new regulations in place, and we all know what regulations do, ipso facto. Yes, ma'am, back there.
The next member of the audience observed that the current Republican candidates don't talk about either of the Bush presidencies. They go back all the way to Reagan. But in a recent New York Times article, it was said that Obama is actually to the right of Ronald Reagan.
In a lot of measurable ways, yes, that's right. Well, this is the answer. The answer to this is incredibly simple. The question is, Barack Obama. If you look at him if you measure presidents on these various statistical ways of measuring ideology, Barack Obama is in a lot of ways to the right of Ronald Reagan. The conservative movement today has tossed the Bushes overboard, both father and son, and looks back to Reagan as this great hero. How do they square all this? It's incredibly simple, because the Bushes are unpopular. If George W. Bush was still popular, they'd still be selling those dumb little statues of him. Remember those? You could put it on your desk. They'd still have those pictures of him saying "mission accomplished." On their. If everything had worked, if he was still popular, it's just really sort of base political calculations. And the reason they don't accept Barack Obama, although some conservatives, some people who are of a conservative mind say, and who aren't sort of completely dazzled by ideology, will acknowledge this, that Barack Obama is actually, as conservatives go, he's pretty good, But the reason for that is because he's a Democrat, and they know they can get better from anybody else, including Mitt Romney is going to deliver more. But wait, I want to say one other thing. They did this to Reagan, too. There was a point in Reagan's presidency where he was unpopular, remember? It was like in 83. Reagan was way down in the polls, and guys like Richard Viguerie were saying, Reagan's never been a real conservative. And then as he comes back and wait a second, did I say that? What was I thinking? He's our great standard bearer. To this day, there's an interview the other day, and this goes back to this question of ideology that is so fascinating to me. I mean, as a kind of sociological thing. This question of ideology, there was an interview, 60 Minutes interview with who's the majority leader in the House, Eric Cantor. And they're talking about, they say, well, you this pledge to never raise taxes. Ronald Reagan raised taxes. And Cantor doesn't know what to say. And one of his aides goes, that's not true. That's not true. How does he know it's not true? Because it's Ronald Reagan. We just know. We just know. It is true. He did raise taxes in '86. It was this great big, compromise. They always talk about it. Yeah. Anyhow, but ideology cancels this out. Anyhow, it's one of the most fascinating aspects of the book. Where do we stand? We need. I think we. No, I think we. I'm flagging here. Two more. Yes, sir.
The next member of the audience observed that around 7 million or more jobs have been exported to the Third World under the global trade agreements. When people talk about the need to create more jobs here in the United States, nobody is talking about changing those rules. It's like filling a bathtub without the drain plugged.
I know. The question, exactly, good point. Free trade agreements, or so-called free trade agreements. I mean, we all know what they really are. They're so that they can put American factories in that little strip along the border with Mexico, and the Mexicans can't nationalize them. That's what the treaty is about. That's what NAFTA is about. Because the Mexicans nationalized the U.S. oil industry back in the 30s, and we want to make sure they never do that again. And so the treaty protects the property rights of the factory owners. We aren't exporting stuff to there, or very little. It's also, we're exporting the factories. I don't need to tell you about why I don't like NAFTA or any of these other agreements. We all know why. The amazing thing here is the political miscalculation. If you run the number, every group in America, with exceptions at the very top, dislikes NAFTA, dislikes signing another trade agreement with some country where they summarily execute people that try to organize unions, or something like that. They're forever doing this crap, right? And if you look at the numbers, and this is another thing that astonishes me. The Tea Party movement hates NAFTA. That's an interesting fact. I was kind of surprised to discover that. And then it occurred to me, it's like all the different ways that Barack Obama and the Ds could have headed off, nip this thing in the bud if they had wanted to. All the different ways they could have cross-pressured those guys. They could have said, okay, we're going to renegotiate NAFTA. And all of a sudden the Tea Party movement would have been in huge... it would have been enormously confusing for them. Their number one issue, and Obama's going to do it. You think the Republicans are going to do that? Hell no. The NAFTA was their idea. It was the sainted Ronald Reagan's idea. He could have done that. He said he was going to on the campaign trail. His, core constituents in the labor movement want him to do it. And it would have done all these things. Satisfied his core constituents, screwed up the Tea Party movement. Did he do it? Hell no. Of course not. And there's many other things like that he could have done. All these sort of really elementary political, moves that he could have made. For example, he used to say he wanted to repeal the Patriot Act. Now, you've got a movement out there in the country that thinks every time you want to do something liberal, it's Big Brother coming to get in our mix. Why not give us national health care and repeal the Patriot Act at the same time? What an awesome move that would be, and how it would confuse these guys. Did he do it? Of course not. I mean, I say of course not. I still don't even get that one, I mean, these people are... Okay, God, I've got to shut up. I just talk too much. There's a guy back here. Yes, and this will be the last one.
The next member of the audience asked why the Democrats are so timid, with some exceptions.
Oh, sure. No, there are good Democrats out there, yeah.
Why don't they make a left populist defense of government? Why are they refusing to do this? The author has made the point that there are tremendous strategic advantages to making these arguments. Why don't they?
Yeah. What do they gain by forfeiting it? Yeah. Why do they do it? The money. There's some money. If they did it, I mean, they could kiss all that Goldman money, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, all that, that's gone. And so they often will do the right thing, like a big stimulus package or propose, public option or something. They'll do the right thing. But they'll justify it in public. They'll always justify it with, well, the experts tell us that we need to, do some, have a stimulus package. Economists all agree that this is what needs to happen. These completely unconvincing explanations. If they really talked about it in a forthright way, a way that might save their skin with the general public, they'd lose their funders. You know what else it is? That's just who they are. They believe in experts and expertise. I mean, I'm around these people all the time. At Washington, D.C., there's this enormous concentration of PhDs. I mean, that doesn't mean anything. When you're in that D.C., that dumb little world of theirs, the word I use for the attitude there is the consensus. Okay, the consensus, and I mean this. It's mainly they imagine themselves to be centrist. This is like the Washington Post worldview, and it's a very predictable view of the world. They hate my writing, by the way. I get the crappiest reviews from the consensus. In fact, when I moved there was somebody told in a newspaper I was outside the consensus. I love that. But in the consensus, you cannot talk that way. Expertise is what it's all about. It's always about appealing to the authority of experts. And, it's always funny to get a whiff of that, of consensus journalism. Every time I open up the Washington Post or I look on one of these, like the Politico, that website or something, something like that, and it's just so out of touch. And I know this is cliches. I'm giving you one cliche after another, but God damn it, it's true. They know nothing about the temper of the country outside of the Beltway. And these are Democrats that we're talking about here. And I know this sounds like a stereotype, but that is the richest city in America, Washington, D.C., I'm including the suburbs here. You look at a list of the richest counties in America, 5 of them, the richest 10 counties in America, 5 of them are the suburbs of Washington, D.C. These people are all very highly educated. It's easily the most highly educated city in America, if you leave out college towns. And that's who they are. And the president and those sort of official Democrats, that's who they answer to. It's sure as hell not to people like me. That's not who they listen to. And it's sure as hell not people like us. That is not who they listen to. Who they listen to are those, consensus voices of expertise inside the Beltway. Let's all get together in the middle. If we can just be reasonable with one another and have a nice, bipartisan get together, we'll all discover that there really is no, to hell with it. Okay. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to author and journalist Thomas Frank talking about his latest book, Pity the Billionaire, The Hard Time Swindle and Unlikely Comeback of the Right. To find out more about Thomas Frank and his work, please visit his website at tcfrank.com. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions of Portland, Oregon. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of free on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at pdxjustice.org. And write to us with your comments and questions at pdxjustice@riseup.net. We'd love to hear from you. Many of our programs are available on DVD or Blu-ray video discs. Please write to us for ordering information. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.
Museums, right? So does the post office. So does the CIA. So does the U.S. Army, for Pete's sake. And now, after all of this has been going on for decades, we suddenly have a people's uprising demanding that we embrace the free market ideology, right? And this only a short while after that selfsame ideology led the world into the greatest economic catastrophe in memory. Yes, amazing is right. It's a good word. Unlikely is another good word. Preposterous would be even better. Okay, think about it. In 2008, the country's financial system suffered. It was actually just after I was here last time. The country's, maybe there's some connection, But in 2008, the country's financial system suffered this kind of epic, breakdown. Largely the result, as nearly every serious observer agrees, of our decades-long effort to roll back bank supervision and encourage financial experimentation. And the banks' stumble quickly plunged the nation and, in fact, the entire world into the worst recession since the 1930s. And yet, as I stand here tonight, the loudest political response to these events are a campaign to roll back regulation, right? They're talking about it right now in South Carolina. Who's going to roll it back the furthest? To strip government employees of the right to organize, like in Wisconsin, and of course to clamp down on federal spending. So yeah, let us give these rebels their due. Let us acknowledge that the conservative comeback of the last couple of years is indeed something unique in the history of American social movements. A mass conversion to free market theory as a response to hard times. Well, thank you so much for coming. I love this bookstore. You know how awesome this place is. Yeah. And I was actually, I was saying it's easy to get lost in the city of books, and then they told me that, that's what it says on their T-shirts. So that wasn't very original. But just speaking as an author, it's books like this that make it possible for people like me, bookstores like this. It is the truth. Hooray for Powells. So... So, Pity the Billionaire. What's it about? You want to know. It's about the confused era that we are living in today. This is a time when Americans are rising up against imaginary threats and rallying to economic theories that they understand only in the gauziest sort of terms. It's a book about a country where fears of a radical takeover became epidemic, even though radicals themselves had long since ceased to play any role in our national life. A country where ideological nightmares conjured up by TV entertainers came to seem more vivid and more compelling than the contents of the news pages. But that's my dumb liberal me talking. If you look at it from a different perspective, this is a miraculous time. This is a great awakening, as certain pundits like to say. It's a revival crusade in which the gospel is the old-time religion of the free market. It's the era of a grassroots rebellion and the incredible recovery of the conservative political movement from the gloomy depths of defeat. And yeah, let me confess, let's admit it, there is something miraculous and something astonishing about this recovery. Think about it this way. These are the barest facts of the matter. Right now, what we're living through is the fourth successful conservative uprising to happen in my lifetime. Each one of them, all a puff with populist bluster, each one standing slightly rightward of its predecessor, and each one helping to compose another chapter in the historical epic that I used to call the Great Backlash, and that others have called the Age of Reagan, or the Age of Greed, or the Conservative Ascendancy, or the Washington Consensus. Think about it this way. It's now been 32 years since the supply-side revolution conquered Washington, D.C., since the free market faith became the dogma of the nation's ruling class, shared by large numbers of Democrats as well as Republicans. We've now lived through decades of deregulation, deunionization, privatization, free trade agreements. I mean, the free market ideal has been projected into every corner of the nation's life. Universities try to put themselves on a market-based footing nowadays. So do hospitals, electric utilities. Before this present economic slump, I had never heard of a recession's victims developing a wholesale taste for Chicago school economics or a spontaneous hostility to the works of Franklin Roosevelt. I'd never heard of that before. Before this recession, people who had been cheated by bankers almost never took that occasion to demand that bankers be freed from the scrutiny of the law, right? And the burden of red tape. That never happened. Before 2009, the man in the breadline did not ordinarily weep for the man lounging on his yacht. Now, the achievement of all this is even more remarkable when you consider the prevailing opinion climate of 3 years ago, of 2008. That's 4 years ago, isn't it? Well, whatever. After the... I don't even know what century it is. After the disasters of the George W. Bush presidency had culminated in this catastrophe on Wall Street, the citizens of Beltway Consensus Land, which is to say my neighbors back in Washington, D.C., they all agreed on the direction in which the country was now traveling. They had seen this movie before, and they knew how it was supposed to go. The plates were shifting. Conservatism's decades-long reign was at an end, they said. An era of liberal activism was at hand. This was the unambiguous mandate of history, or so they thought, as unmistakable as the gigantic crowds that gathered to hear Barack Obama speak as he traveled the campaign trail. You could no more defy this plot line, they thought, than you could write checks on an empty bank account. Now, the thinking behind all this was straightforward cause and effect stuff. The 2008 financial crisis, everyone thought, had clearly discredited the conservative movement's signature economic ideas. Scandal and incompetence had wrecked the movement's ethical claims, and besides, conservatism's taste for strident rhetoric was supposed to be repugnant, right, to this new generation of post-partisan voters that we're always hearing about. Besides, there was the obvious historical analogy that you encountered everywhere you looked back in 2008. We had just been through a replay of the financial disaster of 1929, and now, the pundits said, the automatic left turn of 1932 was here. It was at hand, with the part of Franklin Roosevelt being played by the newly elected Barack Obama. Now, the pundit-approved script for the Republican Party went like this. The GOP, they said, had to moderate itself or face a long period of irrelevance. Okay, remember all that? So what the polite thinking world, I should say, expected from the leaders of the right was repentance. They assumed that conservatives would be humbled by the disasters that had befallen their champion, George W. Bush. That Republicans would now confess their errors and make haste for the political center. The world expected contrition, in other words. And you know what it got was exactly the opposite, and I mean delivered on the point of a bayonet. Instead of complying with the new speed limit, the strategists of the right hit the gas. Instead of seeking accommodation, they went on a quest for ideological purity. Instead of elevating their remaining centrists to positions of power, they purged those guys. And rather than acknowledge that they had enjoyed